Thank you very much, Clemens, for the kind introduction, Jim, for the extremely generous laudation. Thank you to CECIFO and IIPF for this honor. Jim, as you heard, is president of the International Institute of Public Finance, or IIPF. I believe it's a presidency that goes back to the 1930s. Quite a long tradition, but Jim is also a product, in large part, of Harvard University, the presidency of which goes back to the 60s. Indeed, there is a story that in 1910, when Lawrence Lowell was president of Harvard, a visitor came to see him and was told that the president has gone to Washington to meet Mr. Taft. That being William Howard Taft, who at the time held the presumably much less prestigious presidency, that of the United States. So it's a particular honor for me to present the Richard Musgrave Lecture and to celebrate the legacy of a truly foundational figure in public finance. I had the pleasure of meeting him and Peggy Musgrave, also a foundational figure, especially in international taxation, once when I was a PhD student in California, and they were based in Santa Cruz, California, post-Michigan and post-Harvard in the Musgraves' lives. So let me start with a brief outline of what I want to talk about. I'll start with a description of the international tax regime, especially for those of you who may be less familiar with it, and how scholarship in this area has focused on the impact of globalization since the 1980s. Then I'll present briefly some evidence on what is coming to be known as deglobalization. And some brief remarks on its broader consequences for the world beyond taxation, if indeed there is a world beyond taxation, which I think Jim would argue not. And then the main part of the talk will discuss the consequences of deglobalization for international taxation. And I'll present a very simple framework that I hope can serve as a way to understand what these consequences might be. And like any researcher, I will end by calling for more research on this theme. So let me just outline the basic problem of international tax, which let me start with an example. So in the early days of foreign direct investment, General Motors, based in the United States, acquired a car maker in Germany named Opel. And this situation created the possibility of what especially legal scholars in international tax call double taxation. And indeed, the entire field of international tax law is very much directed towards avoiding this problem of double taxation. And people also talk of double non-taxation, although however many times, if you multiply 0 by however many times, you still get 0. So we could just call it double. We could simply call it non-taxation. From an economic perspective, the problem here is the higher rate on multinational firms might discourage multinational activity if multiple countries tax the same income. So in the 1920s, the League of Nations developed a set of principles that underpin the international tax regime that we still have today, by and large. And what this consists of is a set of norms and a network of tax treaties, and these require countries to alleviate double taxation either through the exemption of the foreign income of their resident multinationals or by giving their resident multinationals a tax credit for foreign taxes that they pay. And broadly speaking, this international tax regime has allocated the jurisdiction to tax income between source countries, countries where active business operations take place, and residence countries, the countries where multinational firms are headquartered. Active business income is generally allocated to source countries. Passive income is generally allocated to residence countries, as shown here. So there's a difference between how resident multinationals are treated and non-resident multinationals are treated. Now, this system of international taxation that goes back to the 1920s has come under what many view as considerable pressure in recent decades through the process of globalization. A common and often repeated theme in international tax scholarship and public finance is that globalization has made the international tax regime, or the ITR, if you're fond of abbreviations, made that regime obsolete. And I've just chosen some quotes from Jim's colleague at the University of Michigan, Reuven Aviona, and also Christine Kim, his co-author. But in truth, virtually anyone who writes in this area has made a remark of this nature somewhere in their writings. In the current age of globalization, capital is much more mobile than labor, for instance. And this has given rise to and there's also this discussion of digitalization that's also been very prominent. So this idea that the international tax regime is now obsolete because of globalization has given rise to a series of policy initiatives at the multilateral level on what is known as base erosion and profit shifting, or BEPS, and also to a subsequent initiative known as the Two Pillars Project, which many of you would have heard of, that, for example, the second pillar of which involves a global minimum tax on multinational firms. There have also been unilateral responses, like taxes on digital services, that have also been inspired by much the same theme. However, the focus of my talk is going to be on how the world today appears to be experiencing not globalization, but deglobalization. And this potentially undermines this intellectual premise that so many scholars in international tax have contributed to, and may also undermine these policy responses. So what is deglobalization? This is something that researchers in international trade and international economics have increasingly written about. World trade is, and I've shown you a graph from the work of Goldberg and Reed, and what their figure shows is that while world trade is growing in absolute terms, it has declined as a percentage of world GDP, as we can see, or at the very least it's leveled off. And if you look very hard at it, you might think that it's actually declining, on a declining trend in more recent years. So this phenomenon, or a key part of this phenomenon of deglobalization, was the imposition of tariffs by the United States in 2018, as detailed here. And what we see here is quite a steep rise, albeit from a low base level, in the average tariff rate in 2018. Now, on the whole, the quantitative evidence in the trade data on deglobalization is still fairly limited up to this point. But Goldberg and Reed and others have pointed to a shift in the intellectual environment and the nature of policy debates with respect to international openness. For example, there's evidence from linguistic analysis And there is also the general sense, at least in the United States, that the influence of economists on trade policy and perhaps all kinds of policy has declined, if not disappeared. So this is another figure from Goldberg and Reed, where they show that national security, the term national security, and the term resilience, which tend to be used by people somewhat opposed to globalization, has increased in news articles over the last few years, as have terms like onshoring or reshoring. In fact, they show a very, very sharp spike in recent years. So arguably, the nature of this discourse, of the discourse around international integration and international trade and multinational activity has changed very substantially. And while the slowdown in world trade is still quite limited, these changes in the policy environment suggest that more deglobalization is on the way. We can illustrate this phenomenon with the growing use of national security review by countries. This figure is taken from what my hosts at CESIFO assure me is a highly authoritative outlet, the CESIFO working papers, this one by Eichenauer and Wang, and what they show is how national security review, which I've placed in quotes because I tend to be a little skeptical of it, but has grown among European countries and among non-European OECD countries over time. This paper is part of an emerging body of empirical evidence that suggests that national security review can lead to significant distortions in the global market for corporate control. And therefore, there's significant inefficiencies. Now, of course, it is potentially true that there may be national security ramifications of particular cross-border mergers. But I think we can expect that this process is going to be systematically biased because of the asymmetric incentives of officials. It's very costly for one of these officials to approve a merger that ex post turns out to be problematic. But you get no reward for approving mergers that are actually valuable, which are probably most of them. So I think one contribution that economists can make is to institutional design. Perhaps maybe this may be a kind of a rather wild idea, but perhaps we should treat this a little bit like government's power of eminent domain and require governments to pay compensation to the shareholders of target firms when they disallow mergers. So why has deglobalization happened? I don't believe that there's a clear answer in the literature. There is one view associated, for example, with Danny Roderick at Harvard's Kennedy School, that this is actually a good thing, that globalization went too far. And that this is what's happening now is merely a correction. I tend to be, I'm a little skeptical of that. Another phenomenon that has occurred in recent years is what political scientists call democratic backsliding and democratic decline, even in countries that were once thought to be well-established democracies. And perhaps there is a link between the two. And that would, I think, be an interesting topic for future research. Also, just wanted to briefly talk in more general terms about what the consequences of deglobalization might be. And to move to that topic, we need to think a little bit about what were the consequences of globalization. This is the famous elephant graph constructed by Branko Milanovic. And what it shows is the increase in income over the during what we might now, in retrospect, call the age of globalization, 1988 to 2008. And this shows the increase in real incomes of each percentile of the global income distribution. So this suggests that there were widespread increases in income over this period, especially around the global median. This is not true of necessarily at higher levels of income. For example, the median US person is somewhere around the 85th or 90th percentile of the global income distribution. And their income growth was less robust, though positive. And putting those two things together, I think it follows fairly clearly that there was also a decline in global inequality. And that is something that Milanovic documents as well. This is the global Gini coefficient, and we see a decline in global inequality during the age of globalization. So these are sort of some of the big picture consequences. Now, one can argue about how much weight we should place on a decline in global inequality relative to what appear to be increases in within-country inequality that have occurred over the same period. My own view is that this really, that as economists, we are heirs to a tradition of cosmopolitanism. We should care about human welfare in general, rather than be parochial. But of course there are differences of views on that. This decline in inequality, incidentally, has also been accompanied by a dramatic reduction in the prevalence of poverty globally. These are some figures from the World Bank showing the percentage of the world's population that fell below the World Bank's preferred definition of poverty, and this has gone from around 40% in around 1990 to less than 10% in 2015. Even this, though, doesn't necessarily convince the critics of globalization. Sir Angus Deaton has written recently that he no longer defends the idea that the harm done to working Americans by globalization was a reasonable price to pay for global poverty reduction, even though the estimates of manufacturing job losses in the US during this period really represent perhaps just rounding error in relation to the size of the US labor market. As I understand it, the main intellectual innovation of the critics is to focus on the use of place-based perspective. Essentially, moving costs are, in this view, larger than we've traditionally thought, and that imposes large costs on workers who are displaced, large welfare costs. And I think that's reasonable so far as it goes, but it does seem that that would tend to symmetrically increase the costs of globalization and deglobalization. So just as US workers who are displaced face these large welfare costs due to the high cost of moving, deglobalization is going to have perhaps similar impacts on workers in China. Their costs of not being able to access global markets is also higher than we once thought because of high moving costs. So ultimately, what are the general consequences of deglobalization? We might simply reverse what appear to be the consequences of globalization, right? So straightforward logic would suggest that there will be more poverty and more inequality at a global level. And while there is less evidence for this, we might also throw in perhaps war, pestilence, and famine. Although while we're at it, and apart from all of that, deglobalization seems like a great idea. So now let me turn And can I just check with Clemens about time? Great. So let me then turn to the main topic for today, which is the implications of deglobalization for international taxation. The main points I want to draw out are how tariffs relate to repatriation taxes. I will take tariffs as being the archetypal policy instrument associated with deglobalization, although we can also imagine others. The impact of tariffs on profit shifting, the broader impact of deglobalization on profit shifting, which has, as I noted earlier, been an important concern for scholars and policymakers, and how we should think about about the optimal way to set international tax policy in a world in which there are tariffs and in which those tariffs are not amenable to reform. And to do this, I want to present a very simple conceptual framework. You can think of this as a toy model, if you like, that tries to capture particularly the idea that there are ownership effects on productivity. So the modern theory of multinational activity, of why firms become multinational, stresses the advantages and disadvantages of the common ownership of assets across different locations. And that framework, the OLI framework, as it's sometimes called, associated with John Dunning and the Reading School of International Business Studies, is kind of the underpinning for this. So let's assume then a continuum of firms, or you can also think of these as establishments, in a country F, I've called it a foreign country, but that is from a US perspective, meaning a non-US country, where each of these firms has a fixed value, D, under its domestic owners, these firms also, however, these firms vary in the value that they would have under the ownership of a U.S. multinational. So there's this value V sub US is bounded from above by some finite number, and it's going to be larger than D for some firms and lower for others, right? Capturing the idea that for some firms there are going to be these positive ownership effects, and for others there are going to be negative ones. Let's focus on, I've drawn here just a very simple uniform distribution, but the intuition extends to essentially any kind of distribution function that you choose. And so let's assume that there's a US multinational firm that can make take it or leave it offers to the owners of these domestic firms. Let's normalize country F's tax rate to 0. And the US has a positive tax rate, and it may impose what is known as a repatriation tax. So those of you who are not aficionados of international tax, what that refers to is the dividends paid by foreign affiliates to their parent firm. The U.S. can impose a repatriation tax at rate tau. Jim is actually fond of calling this the sacred letter tau, letter that is sacred to tax economists. Just as a starting point, note that over here, this set of firms has higher value under U.S. ownership than under domestic ownership. The firms over here do not. And so ideally, we'd like to induce an outcome where all of these firms are acquired by the U.S. multinational, and these firms are not. First, start with no repatriation tax. here we're going to find that the U.S. multinational will acquire all of these firms and will refrain from acquiring any of these. So we have no distortion to the optimal structure of ownership. This outcome maximizes global welfare, which can be characterized as follows, and I will not go into the details of why, but it also maximizes U.S. national welfare, as it happens, which is characterized as follows. So this is our baseline without a repatriation tax. What happens? So ultimately, we're going to want to discuss what happens to tariffs. But first, let's think about what happens when there's a positive repatriation tax, when the sacred letter tau is set to some positive number. And we'll also, so this repatriation tax is generally imposed at the time the dividend is paid, which creates the opportunity for its deferral, sometimes for deferral over very long time periods. But let's assume that the repatriation tax really matters, which means which is true when, say that, for example, there's a dividend constraint where the U.S. Multinational must, for example, pay its common stockholders dividends, and therefore it has to pay itself a dividend from the foreign affiliate. So if that is the case, then the set of these foreign firms that are acquired by the U.S. multinational will shrink. There's now this tax wedge, and we see an ownership distortion over here, where some firms that are more valuable under U.S. ownership remain under domestic ownership, and so global welfare is not as high as it could be. So that's all by way of background, right? This is a mode of analysis that is familiar in public finance when we study the taxation of multinational firms. Now let's turn to this phenomenon of deglobalization, and in particular, let's assume that the U.S. imposes a tariff at rate T, not to be confused with tau, the sacred letter. So we'll look at the impact of this on intra-MNC or intra-firm trade. According to international trade scholars, much of world trade it takes the form of intra-firm trade. In an authoritative book chapter on this topic, Jim and his co-authors, Foley et al., estimate this number to be about 40% for the U.S., and estimates elsewhere tend to be higher, if anything. So what happens here? Well, we can let's say decompose this value under U.S. ownership into revenues and in the present value of revenues and the present value of costs. For convenience, I'm just going to assume that it's only the costs that vary, although the intuition is a little more general. Then the tariffs are going to be paid on the revenue the firm generates by selling some output to the U.S. parent. Right, as follows. So assume we have the foreign subsidiary over here, and assume that it produces output at a cost of $90 and sells this to the U.S. parent for $100. Then under this tariff regime, it's going to remit $2 in tariffs, absent any behavioral responses. Of course, ultimately, the U.S. parent is presumably selling this output transformed in some way to final consumers, and the price paid by final consumers will adjust. But let's just focus on this transaction. So here, the multinational now must remit $2 in tariffs. But this situation looks quite similar to one where the again, the affiliate produces an output at a cost of 90 and sells it for 100, but there is no tariff, and instead there's a repatriation tax of 20%. Right. Again, the MNC remits $2. So that suggests that we can set up form some sort of equivalence, at least under certain assumptions, at least, between repatriation taxes and tariffs. Recall, so this is what the situation was under the repatriation tax, right? We had this set of domestic firms being acquired by the U.S. multinational, and this ownership distortion. Well, we can get exactly the same outcome, at least within the framework of this very simple model, when there are tariffs. So now there is again a wedge where the U.S. multinational doesn't acquire all of the firms that it would be socially efficient to acquire, because it anticipates paying the tariff on future transactions with its affiliates, and so the U.S. multinational now acquires only these firms, as you can see from the way it's been drawn, that set can be exactly identical to the set of firms acquired under the repatriation tax, if we were to set the tariff at this level. Now, this equivalence is achieving that precise equivalence becomes a little bit more complicated when we have a more complicated setup. For instance, this precise equivalence will hold only if the tariff is affiliate specific, right? It varies across affiliates. If R were to vary across affiliates, and that kind of tariff or tax might be informationally too demanding to be plausible. But I think the more general and more important point is that tariffs can distort global ownership patterns in the same way that a repatriation tax can do. This is, I think, an efficiency cost that's a little different from the familiar deadweight loss of tariffs that we know that we thought we knew all about, but perhaps some do not. So the upshot is that within this framework, at least, we can analyze the impact of tariffs using tools that have been developed in public finance to study the impact of repatriation taxes. Now, in the example I gave you earlier, the numerical example of the foreign affiliate and the U.S. multinational, the output cost $90, and it was exogenously being sold to the U.S. multinational for a price of $100. But you might ask, well, why not? Since this is not an arm's length transaction, why not modify the transfer price? And certainly, this firm could do that, subject to the relevant laws, which are mostly based on the arm's length standard. However, in this particular scenario, and I think in a wide range of what we can think of as typical scenarios, where the headquarters country has a higher tax rate than the source country or the country of the affiliate, manipulating this transfer price to reduce the tariff will tend to increase the global income tax liabilities of the multinational firm. Right. So yes, it can reduce its tariff payments, but it would increase its global income tax burden. And so there's a limitation to the use of strategic transfer pricing in this setting. Now, one can imagine other settings where both tariff avoidance and income tax avoidance work in the same direction. But I think this is usually taken to be the more typical kind of scenario. So under these typical circumstances, there is a trade-off between setting your transfer prices to minimize income taxes and to minimize tariff payments. What that suggests is that this has significant implications for our understanding of the phenomenon of profit shifting and how serious that might be. There's a trade-off that has been noted in the literature. There are papers by Blowen et al., Kohlhaaser and Wielhauer, for example, that discuss the trade-off between strategic transfer pricing to minimize tariffs and strategic transfer pricing to minimize income taxes. But perhaps because tariffs have not hitherto, in the age of globalization, have not been that important, this has not been a major focus of this literature. But it clearly seems to be something that researchers should look at carefully. In policy terms, recall this in the paradigm that was articulated by Ruven Aviona and others, where globalization makes the international tax regime obsolete. One of the major concerns has been profit shifting, right? Hence the base erosion and profit shifting initiative of the OECD, also the global minimum tax in Pillar 2. But what I've just gone through suggests that in a deglobalized world where tariffs are important, profit shifting through strategic transfer pricing may be of significantly lesser concern. That's not to say there are not going to be other major problems in this world, but profit shifting may not be as important as it was in the age of deglobalization, with the caveat that it may not, that this may not apply to certain other forms of profit shifting, such as the location of debt in low tax jurisdictions. Moving to essentially the final point that I want to make, what is optimal? What is optimal tax policy in a world where tariffs exist and there is no immediate prospect of removing them? So they cannot be eliminated because a policymaker has chosen it and is not amenable to advice on that issue. How should international tax policy be set? That's a fairly general question, but I want to focus particularly on what is the optimal repatriation tax if we want to eliminate ownership distortions or mitigate ownership distortions. Now, you might ask, you might think that this entire question is a little misconceived as policy advice, because after all, we're starting with the premise that there is a policymaker who has chosen to impose tariffs, and such a policymaker is unlikely to be amenable to advice on what is optimal international tax policy. If he or she were, then he or she would presumably remove the tariff. So there's a little bit of a paradox here in thinking about optimal policy in this world. But you might say, well, as policy advice, this isn't all that coherent. On the other hand, we can also think of an inquiry into what optimal policy is as being not necessarily advice to a policymaker, who who doesn't want our advice, and who we may not particularly want to advise either. But we can think of it instead as a normative benchmark, right, that is useful in analysis. So in that spirit, let's think about what is the optimal repatriation tax in this setting. So what's happening here, recall, is that the U.S. multinational is acquiring foreign firms in this region here, and we'd like them to also acquire acquire these firms. And so it turns out, the answer is actually very simple and very, very intuitive, which is that when we derive the optimal repatriation tax, trying to extend acquisitions over here, it necessarily has to be negative. Right. So here we have no ownership distortion when tau is set to this expression here, noting that it is negative. So what does that mean? What is a negative repatriation tax? Recall that the repatriation tax is imposed when a dividend is paid from the foreign affiliate to the parent firm. What does a negative repatriation tax mean? Well, essentially it would mean that whenever the foreign affiliate pays a dividend to its parent, the residence country of the parent then provides a kind of something like a matching grant. It writes a check to the U.S. parent. Obviously, politically, this is nonsensical, and it would have been even in the age of globalization, right? But as I said before, this is offered here more as a normative benchmark to think about what the consequences of various policies might be relative to that benchmark. So I believe I don't think I'm close on time, but I'm essentially out of material. So I will conclude and just leave a little bit more time for questions and discussion, if that works for you. The main point that I try to make is that the transformation of the global economy from globalization to deglobalization I think requires a completely new research agenda in international tax and in public finance research that's related to international tax. And I've tried to provide a very simple conceptual framework. I call it a toy model that can tell us a little bit about how we might analyze these new realities. As a researcher, one has a kind of vested interest in promoting more research, but I think these are genuinely new circumstances that are arising, and it seems reasonable to call for more research on the consequences. So thank you very much for your attention.